The Nazis under Hitler promised unstoppable soldiers by giving them meth pills that turned men into tireless predators. But behind this so-called strength was a nightmare. Women across Europe became victims of drug-fueled cruelty. Families were torn apart, and generations were scarred. The full truth of these crimes remains more disturbing than most dare to imagine. It started in the late 1930s, when Germany was looking for ways to make its people stronger, faster, and more productive. Factories were running day and night. Schools pushed students to study harder. And the army was preparing for war. In this environment, a new drug appeared that seemed like a gift from science. In 1937, the Berlin-based company Temmler introduced a pill called Pervitin. It was methamphetamine in tablet form. But most people didn't know what that really meant. What they did know was that one small pill could wipe away tiredness, give a burst of energy, and create a strange sense of confidence. At first, it was sold in pharmacies just like aspirin or cough medicine. Housewives used it to get through long days of cooking, cleaning, and looking after children. University students took it before exams to stay awake all night. Office clerks, truck drivers, and factory workers started using it too. Advertisements in German newspapers showed smiling women who were able to finish all their chores without fatigue. Doctors prescribed it freely because there were almost no rules controlling its use. People thought of it as harmless, like a vitamin that gave extra energy. The effect was immediate and powerful. Someone who took the pill could suddenly work or study for hours without rest. Hunger seemed to vanish, and with it came a rush of confidence. Many Germans began to believe they had found the secret to endless productivity. But no one talked about the darker side: nervousness, anger, and the crash that came after the high. These warnings were ignored, especially once the drug caught the attention of the German military. By 1938, military doctors started experimenting with Pervitin on soldiers. They noticed that men who normally struggled to march long distances could suddenly walk for hours without stopping. Their fear seemed to disappear, and their focus sharpened. For Nazi leaders preparing for rapid invasions, this sounded like the perfect tool. Germany was planning lightning-fast attacks that required soldiers to move day and night without rest. And Pervitin looked like the answer. In 1939, the German army officially ordered millions of tablets. During the invasion of Poland that September, soldiers carried Pervitin in their pockets and swallowed them before long marches or sudden night battles. Reports from the front described entire units moving without food or sleep for nearly 2 days straight. Commanders were shocked at how long their men could keep going. Soon, the drug wasn't just for ordinary soldiers. Officers, pilots, and SS guards also began to use it regularly. At first, Pervitin seemed like a miracle weapon, but the cost was hidden. The drug erased not only hunger and fear, but also basic human restraint. It dulled emotions and made soldiers more aggressive. Many lost the ability to feel pity or guilt. For the men who swallowed these little white pills, fatigue disappeared, but so did morality, and women would pay the heaviest price for this addiction. In May 1940, Hitler unleashed his Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, against France. It was not a slow or careful campaign. German tanks rolled across borders, planes filled the skies, and soldiers advanced at a speed that shocked the world. Behind this success was not only military planning, but also the pills the men carried. French and British defenders grew exhausted, while German soldiers seemed unstoppable, like machines. The battles were brutal, but it was the civilians, especially women, who were affected the most. When German soldiers pushed into towns like Sedan, Abbeville, and Amiens, many local men had either fled, been captured, or were fighting elsewhere. That left women, children, and the elderly, almost defenseless. German troops, high on meth, stormed through these places with unnatural energy. They didn't just fight soldiers. They also turned their rage and hunger for power against ordinary people. Women in villages quickly realized they were in danger. Some tried to hide in basements or barns, hoping the chaos would pass. Others fled into the woods with children, carrying only what they could. But many were found. German soldiers, restless and aggressive from the drug, forced their way into homes. Mothers were dragged out while their children screamed. Daughters and even elderly grandmothers were not spared. For the soldiers fueled by Pervitin, there were no limits. The pill erased their exhaustion and gave them a twisted kind of strength. Assaults lasted for hours, with women left broken and terrified. For some, survival meant years of silence, carrying scars no one could see. After the war, scattered reports emerged about what happened in these towns. In Abbeville, for example, French authorities found that entire families had been destroyed, not just by bombs, but by the soldiers who passed through. Similarly, when Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the country collapsed within weeks. The Polish army fought bravely, but was outnumbered and outgunned. Once the fighting ended, the occupation began, and daily life for civilians turned into a nightmare. For women, the danger was everywhere. SS men, Gestapo agents, and regular soldiers patrolled the streets, many of them fueled by Pervitin. The drug made them restless, aggressive, and cruel. It erased the little restraint they might have had. In cities like Krakow, Warsaw, and Lublin, night raids became common. German forces would burst into homes, searching for weapons, Jewish families, or anything they considered suspicious. But very often, the real targets were women. Young girls, mothers, and even elderly women were dragged away in front of their families. Sometimes they were taken to police stations, other times to makeshift barracks set up in schools or warehouses. Few ever came back the same. The Nazis also created something far more organized and chilling. Across Poland, they set up field brothels for their soldiers. These were not ordinary places. They were filled with women who had been forced into service. Many were Polish, but soon others came from surrounding regions. Some were only teenagers. At night, the sounds from these places echoed through the walls. Screams, cries, and the endless footsteps of men who never seemed to tire. The women trapped inside had no escape. Life for ordinary Polish women outside these brothels was hardly safer. On the streets, German patrols often stopped women at random. They were forced to carry heavy loads for soldiers or clean their quarters. Others were taken away under the excuse of questioning. Families who tried to protect their daughters often faced brutal punishments themselves. Entire households could be destroyed in one night, all because a group of meth-fueled soldiers decided to act without mercy. But more was to come. In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in history. More than 3 million German soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union. To prepare for this massive attack, the German High Command ordered millions of Pervitin tablets. These pills were packed into soldiers' kits alongside ammunition and rations. The idea was to keep the men awake for days, able to march hundreds of kilometers, and strike without pause. The invasion was brutal from the very beginning. Planes bombed cities, tanks rolled over fields, and villages were burned to the ground. But behind the battle lines, another war began, one directed at women. In Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia, Soviet women became some of the first targets. Soldiers, restless and wired on meth, stormed into villages with a level of violence that seemed endless. Many women were dragged from their homes or pulled out of hiding places. Barns, stables, and abandoned huts became scenes of horror. Some women were killed on the spot, often after being assaulted. Others were taken away as prisoners, forced to march with the army, or locked in makeshift camps. With Pervitin in their veins, the soldiers did not slow down. Soviet records collected after the war revealed just how widespread the violence was. In Belarus alone, entire villages reported that their female population had been brutalized. In Ukraine, rural communities were left shattered, with families destroyed and children orphaned. Numbers are hard to confirm, but historians agree that the scale of the abuse was massive, touching hundreds of thousands of women across the front. By 1942, the Nazi system of control had spread far across Europe, and with it came the creation of more military brothels. These were not secret or small. They were organized and spread through occupied countries like Poland, France, and later even parts of the Soviet Union. Inside the concentration camps, special sections were set aside for this purpose. The Nazis claimed these brothels were meant to reward their soldiers and keep them disciplined. But in reality, they were built on the suffering of thousands of women. The women inside did not enter by choice. Most were rounded up during raids, taken from villages, or selected directly from prison camps. They were promised work in kitchens or factories, but were forced into sexual slavery instead. Many were young, still in their teenage years. For them, life changed in a single day. One moment, they were at home or working in the fields. The next, they were locked inside a brothel with no way out. The men who visited these places were often under the influence of drugs. SS guards and soldiers were given Pervitin before entering. For the women, this meant endless nights of torment. The drug took away the natural limits of the body, and the women were forced to endure until they collapsed. Conditions inside these brothels were horrific. Rooms were overcrowded, often filthy, and the women received little food or medical care. Disease spread quickly, especially syphilis and other infections. Pregnancies were common, and most ended with forced abortions, or worse. Guards beat women who resisted or could no longer work. Many didn't survive long. Historians estimate that the average lifespan of a woman trapped in these brothels was less than 1 year. Exhaustion, sickness, and violence killed them faster than anything else. For many of these women, death was the only way the suffering ended, because the camps only kept expanding and getting even more brutal. One of the camps, Ravensbrück, was unlike most of the others because it was built to hold women. Opened in 1939, it became the largest women's concentration camp in Nazi Germany. Over the years, more than 130,000 women from across Europe passed through its gates. They came from Poland, the Soviet Union, France, Germany, and many other countries. Some were political prisoners, some were Jews, and others were simply women caught up in the war. For all of them, Ravensbrück became a place of suffering. The camp was run by SS guards, many of whom used Pervitin regularly. They were given long shifts with no rest, and instead of making them tired, the pills gave them an unnatural energy that turned into abuse. Women in the camp quickly learned that there was no safe hour of the day. Beatings, shouting, and random punishments could happen at any time, day or night. Life inside the camp was designed to break women completely. Prisoners were forced into hard labor from the moment the sun came up. Some worked in nearby factories, sewing uniforms for soldiers or making parts for weapons. Others carried heavy loads, dug ditches, or worked in freezing weather with no warm clothing. Food rations were so small that women grew weaker each week. Hunger gnawed at them constantly, and many collapsed from exhaustion. Guards, often high on meth, responded not with pity, but with kicks and blows. The camp also served as a site of sexual violence. Guards and officers used women as they wished. Some prisoners were selected and forced into brothels that were run inside or near the camp. Others were assaulted in secret and silenced with threats of death. For the victims, there was no escape, no safe corner to hide. Medical experiments were another kind of torture women faced in these camps. Nazi doctors carried out experiments that involved meth or Pervitin because the Nazis wanted to see how far the human body could be pushed. Female prisoners, many of them young, were forced into these experiments without any choice. Some women were injected with high doses of the drug and then ordered to stay awake for days. Guards would beat them or pour cold water over them if they began to close their eyes. The doctors wanted to see how long a person could survive without rest. Others were given meth and then forced to do heavy labor, like carrying stones or running until they collapsed. The goal was to test how much strength the drug could give before the body completely broke down. There were also experiments where women were given other drugs alongside meth to test reactions. Some became violently ill. Others suffered heart attacks or seizures. Once the women could no longer continue, they were often executed, and their bodies were dissected for research. What made it even more cruel was that the results were carefully written down, but the women's names were ignored. To the Nazis, they were not people, just numbers and test subjects. Families never knew what happened to them. These experiments left almost no survivors, and the memory of those who suffered was nearly erased. The largest and deadliest camp of all was Auschwitz, which became the symbol of Nazi terror. More than 1 million people were killed there, most of them Jews, but also Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners, and many others. In this place of constant death, meth was another tool that fueled cruelty. SS guards were given Pervitin to keep them awake during long shifts, during gas chamber operations, and while carrying out mass shootings. The drug did not just keep them alert, it stripped away their last traces of pity and made them act like machines. Women in Auschwitz faced the worst of this. At night, guards who were high on meth stormed into the female barracks. They dragged women outside without warning. The victims were often chosen at random, but many times the youngest and weakest were singled out because the guards believed they could not fight back. Pregnant women, teenagers, and even children were pulled into the darkness. Some were taken to secluded areas and never returned. Others were thrown into punishment blocks, where the abuse was relentless. Women who were too weak to work after these assaults were usually sent straight to the gas chambers. The cruelty fed by meth created a cycle of torment that destroyed countless lives, and it soon spread into more territories. When Italy switched sides in 1943 and surrendered to the Allies, German troops quickly occupied large parts of the country. For Italian women, this marked the beginning of a new nightmare. Reports from regions like Tuscany, Lazio, and Emilia-Romagna tell of brutal assaults carried out by soldiers who often used Pervitin. Women tried to hide wherever they could, but the soldiers searched every corner. Once caught, they were dragged into the open and attacked. Some women were murdered afterward to silence them. Others were left alive, but broken, abandoned in fields or along roadsides. Families were forced to witness what happened, adding another layer of humiliation and pain. The violence left entire villages shattered. In many communities, several generations of women were targeted on the same night. Survivors carried the memory for the rest of their lives, and in many places the silence around these crimes lasted decades. The scars were not only on the bodies of the women, but also on the identity of whole towns, where the trauma was passed down through stories and memories. By 1944 and 1945, Germany was collapsing under the pressure of the Allies in the West and the Soviets in the East. But instead of stopping their cruelty, retreating German troops often became more violent. In East Prussia, Poland, and parts of Hungary, women were caught in the middle of the chaos. Soldiers, desperate and angry, fueled themselves with Proviton to stay awake and keep moving. In villages along the retreat paths, Soviet and Polish women faced assaults almost daily. Some were dragged from homes, and others were attacked in front of their families. The soldiers, weakened from hunger and exhaustion, relied on meth to push through long nights, and that same drug made their violence relentless. For the women, there was no safety. Even those who tried to flee were often hunted down. Many towns were left in silence afterward. Survivors rarely spoke, and in some cases, whole communities were wiped out. For some women, liberation never arrived. They died before Allied or Soviet forces reached them, their stories buried with them. Even as the Reich collapsed, meth kept the cruelty alive. When the war ended in 1945, millions of women were left scarred. Many were never able to speak of what happened. Survivors carried physical injuries, diseases, and deep trauma. The world tried to move on, but for many females, the war never truly ended.